Hello, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about temporality in writing, in fiction specifically. Now, this traditionally is what I talk about when I say pacing. When I tell a student that, hey, your pacing is too fast, maybe you slow down a little bit. But we'll get to pacing in just a couple minutes here. First, we need to work our way up to it. As we're going to see today, this is a lot more complicated. And the way to start talking about these complications is to pull out a quote. This is a quote from Lance Olson. We read his work at the beginning of the semester, Architecture is a Possibility. And in it, he says, established narrativity evinces a temporality that includes belief in an agreed upon stable past, an agreed upon stable present, and anticipation of future resolution. What does this mean? This means that when people read, they look to make sense of the chaos that is their lives. And writing does a very good job of that through predefined structures. Stories have a beginning, a middle, and an end. People either overcome or don't overcome the obstacles laid out in front of them. But it's all presented in a nice, neat shell. And that often in our lives is not the case. And that's what this quote is pointing at, is that the temporality that we include in our fiction means that when you write about the past of whatever narrative you're putting in, it's a stable, agreed upon past that the reader can see and make sense of. Or maybe they can't make sense of it, and then that leads to a stable, agreed upon present, in which perhaps the characters start to sort out what happened in the past. And then that leads to the anticipation that the reader has that because of this story moving past to present to future, there will be a resolution. And oftentimes, especially in our digital world where everything is fragmented, this isn't how life works. The past is not agreed upon. It is not stable. Look at one history book. How does it represent the world? Look at another history book. How does it depict that same event? Then look at the stories that aren't included in history books, the voices that are not contained in those history books, and see what they have to say about that same subject. Because I guarantee they're going to have something very different to talk about than what is in those history books. Whose voices? Who is the one who agrees upon this past, present, and future? So this is abstract, right? This is philosophical. But it does highlight what we've talked about before, that people come to writing because it makes sense of the world. And writing that reflects the world oftentimes doesn't make sense. And you'll be seeing a little bit of that in your weekly reading that we'll be doing for discussion. So that's one way we can think about temporality in fiction, is that the way it is traditionally used, the writer makes sense of the world for the reader. Because the past leads to the present, leads to the future, and the acts that happen in each one of those tie in, cause and effect, and make sense for the reader at the end of it. Okay? So another way that we can think about time in fiction is that there isn't just one time. There are three. There are three different times. The first one is the time that happens in the narrative. How much time happens inside the story itself? And you can have a wide range of different times. Ulysses by James Joyce famously takes place over one day. My favorite example of time moving in a narrative is the Wheel of Time series by Robert Jordan. I almost forgot his name. In which about a full year takes place in the first book. And every book after that, and it was a series that went on for about 10 books, it was a fantasy series, got progressively shorter and shorter until the final books took place over the span of, say, a month or two. because there was so much going on. All the books were the same length, but that first book had fewer characters, fewer events happening. That last book, more characters, more events, and therefore time got progressively shorter and shorter and shorter in every single increment. He also died before he completed the book series, so get ready for a change of authorship for that last one there. The next bit of time that we can talk about, the type of time that we have, is time for the writer. How long it takes you to write a piece. Because you might say, well, this time doesn't matter. Oh, this time absolutely matters. We only have so much time to write. Mortality and all that. We also live in a world in which things happen. So sometimes you start writing a book and the world changes. And maybe that book doesn't fit as well as it once did. This happened to Stephen Graham Jones. He wrote a book called Demon Theory, except another book, House of Leaves, which we'll talk about a little bit later, got to press first. And that book did a lot of the same things that Stephen Graham Jones's work was doing. And so he had to change his work because he wasn't able to get his book to publication first. So time mattered in that case. We also have time for the reader. How long does it take your reader to go through the book? If your book is 1,000 pages long, like, say, Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace, it's going to take a long time to read that book for the reader to go through it. Additionally, it took David Foster Wallace about 10 years to write that book. And this is interesting because all three of these different times are different. They operate in different ways. And that's something to note, right? The narrative is the one that the reader see. How long it takes you to read James Joyce's Ulysses is probably more in a day than the time takes for the narrative to actually progress inside the story itself. And it took James Joyce 10 years to write it. So, different times. The experience of reading a book in, say, one day when you fall in love with a book is vastly different than dragging yourself through a book for 6 months because you feel some sort of obligation of finishing it. That's going to change the reader's experience. Okay. Next, the next way we can talk about this is, I can hammer on my keyboard and try to find the right buttons. There we go. Is to talk about pacing. And this is something that I talk with beginning writers about a whole bunch. And I guarantee some of you have heard this, and perhaps I've said it to you, of slow down. Show, don't tell. Okay? This is a pacing thing. If a story is written too quickly, the reader isn't able to see the world because the pacing is too fast. There aren't as many details. So oftentimes, I urge writers to slow down, slow their pacing so they can add more details. And essentially what I'm saying is don't summarize. Because summary excludes detail. But here is the hidden truth of what I tell beginning writers. That's not necessarily true. You can summarize, and you can summarize in a way that still includes details, like Len Hagenian's My Life, which we will be reading for this week. It is summary. The pacing is blisteringly fast. It also challenges temporality inside of it, in that one event doesn't really seem to lead to the next event, and yet time passes, and time passes really, really fast. But she does it in a way that she still includes details, brilliant details, wonderful, lush details. It's hard to do. And that's where I tell beginning writers, slow down, really make the scene, show the setting, show where the characters are. Because that's easier for a beginning writer to do and it's harder to summarize while keeping those details. So, while summary is oftentimes demonized, that's not entirely true. It's just hard to do. To speed up so much that you're skipping over things, but you're still giving the reader those lush details. You're being specific in your language. The other way that we can go with this is slowing your pacing down so much. This one is, we'll call it the stuck in mud pacing. This is where your 1,000-page novel takes place over the span of one day. One of your examples, The Mezzanine by Nicholson Baker, takes place over the span of one person entering a building, walking through the mezzanine, going up an escalator, and then re-entering their office door. It's 120 pages. How do you slow down that much? How do you possibly do that? And so this is why for this week's reading, we're going to be looking at Lynn Hegenian's work, where she's summarizing, but we're also going to be looking at Nicholson Baker, or I forget the other work name off the top of my head, but another work that really slows down that pacing. So what happens when you as a writer decide that you want to speed up so much that the cause and effect of the world falls away? Or you want to slow down so much that you spend 120 pages having someone walk across a room? What happens when you push time to such extremes? And that's places for you to explore. All of this, places for you to explore the temporality of the stable present, the stable past. What happens if you play with these ideas? What happens if you play around with time and narrative, time for writer, time for reader? I don't even know how you do that, but you absolutely can. And then, of course, the pacing itself. What happens when you push it or when you change it? When you go slow motion in one scene and supersonic in the next scene? What happens to the writer? Sorry, what happens to the writer? What happens to the reader? What happens to everything that I was talking about up here? Is that a way of challenging it? Something for you to try.